Beneath a strange old oak tree, the search began. In 1795, 3 boys found a deep pit built a century before. They were convinced it held something of immense value. The clues uncovered were so tantalizing that men have been digging ever since. Today, 2 centuries later, the search continues for the buried treasure of Oak Island. A local legend says the mysterious treasure of Oak Island will be found only when 7 lives have been lost. The treacherous money pit has already claimed 6.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
One of the world's most elaborate treasure hunts is presently underway on Oak Island off the east coast of Canada. In the 1600s, the waters of Nova Scotia were a haven for pirates, eluding British and Spanish pursuit. Most searchers have assumed the brilliant buccaneer, Captain Kidd, chose Oak Island to conceal a priceless treasure. Others have expected to find Spanish gold plundered from Mexico and South America. Still others believed the lost crown jewels of Marie Antoinette had been buried there. As early as 1720, strange lights had been seen at night on the island's coast. 2 fishermen who went out to investigate vanished. So for nearly a century after, everyone kept his distance from the uninhabited island. The mainland farmers considered it taboo. Finally, in 1795, 3 brave farm boys set out on an adventure which In Search Of has recreated. Daniel McGinnis, the leader, all of 18, was more fascinated than frightened by the specter of danger. He convinced his 2 best friends to come out and see something peculiar he'd discovered the day before. On an October morning, the island looked friendly, almost inviting. Daniel took them to a great old oak tree. Over a clear depression in the ground reached a curious bare limb, which had been sawed off a long time ago. The limb had obviously been used to hoist something very heavy.
Let's dig.
It must be pirate treasure. They planned to have it up and be home by lunch. But they hit flagstones set in a circular pattern made of rock not found on the island. This was the first of many puzzling barriers to their search. 10 feet down, they struck what sounded like a wooden treasure chest. But it was instead a platform of very old logs set tight into the pit, caulked with ship's putty. They also noticed pickaxe marks in the hard clay walls. Clearly, they were re-excavating a very old shaft. They were careful to be home by dark. Days later, they got down to 20 feet, and hit another log platform. There was no way they could have known, but this wood has since been carbon dated to 1575, the era of the Spanish conquest. Weeks later, yet another layer at 30 feet, and winter was coming. With only picks and shovels, the boys had dug as deep as they could, but they weren't ready to give up. They convinced their neighbors that what they had found could make them all rich. In the next few years, a doctor named Simeon Linz raised enough money for a major excavation.
Whoa, whoa, pick it up. Back over there, whoa, back, whoa, back, oh, back, G, back, G.
Every 10 feet, they struck another log platform with layers of charcoal and ship's putty, all the way down to 90 feet. If there were treasure, it was buried not only deep, but ingeniously. It was late one day when they found the strangest clue of all. They sensed they were onto something important. But the letters were like none they had ever seen. Was it a sign they were close to the treasure, or a warning? They worked very late that evening, and finally, probing at 98 feet, heard the welcome sound of a large hollow vault. Night forced a halt. Returning at daybreak, they fully anticipated being rewarded for what had become 8 years of hard labor. Their expectations were to be thwarted, however, by a diabolical trap that waited in the pit. "30 feet down, Guinness had fallen into water. At least 60 feet of water had somehow filled the pit during the night. The treasure they had almost touched now seemed as far away as the moon. Yet a half-century later, the inscription on the stone would be decoded to read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. This promise of wealth inspired the next search group. When pumping failed to lower the water level, they sent down test drills. Samples from the drill indicated 2 large chests encased in cement. The men on the surface could hear loose metal rattling around inside the chests. And then, one small fragment came up. The engineer wrote in his report, 3 gold links resembling an ancient watch chain. For the first time, here was evidence of fabulous wealth. In 1850, another search group noticed the water in the money pit rose and fell with the tides. Exploring at nearby Smith's Cove, they discovered stone-lined drainage channels leading toward shore. And even more bizarre, tons of coconut husk fiber, like a blanket, under the entire beach. This giant man-made sponge kept ocean water flowing into the channels. But the nearest coconut tree was 2,000 miles away. Their hopes of blocking the water went out with the first tide. Frederick Blair, a Nova Scotia insurance salesman formed another search party in 1893. Their worst suspicions were confirmed. They found the stone channels led all the way from the beach to the money pit. No wonder they could never pump it dry. The last charge seemed to blast through into a subterranean cavity. They hoped this had finally stopped the flow of water. To check the results, they poured concentrated dye into the money pit and kept a close watch on the shoreline. The dye came up, but to their amazement, on both sides of the island. They finally realized the entire island had been engineered to continually flood the money pit. By the end of the 19th century, it's recorded that 2 workmen had died, and the diabolically designed money pit still kept its secret. The next century would bring even more provocative clues and greater tragedy. For 300 years, Oak Island has been a focal point for greed and curiosity. Since Daniel McGinnis discovered the money pit, men have spent more than $2 million digging for the treasure, unsuccessfully. Perhaps as intriguing as the treasure itself is the question, who took such elaborate means to conceal it? Maybe Blackbeard had Oak Island in mind when he boasted, "I've buried my treasure where none but Satan and myself can find it." Before he could recover it, however, he met an untimely death. All that coconut fiber suggests South America. One theory holds that a Spanish galleon wrecked on Oak Island had to conceal a fortune in Mayan or Inca gold. Others believe the lost crown jewels of France were buried here. When Marie Antoinette was guillotined, it's known that her lady-in-waiting escaped across the Atlantic to Nova Scotia. One search party in 1909 was convinced of this theory. Among the diggers, a young lawyer on his summer vacation, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Recent scholarship, however, has proven the jewels never left France. In 1937, Gilbert Hedden, a New Jersey millionaire, came upon what appeared to be an authentic treasure map. In an obscure book called Captain Kidd and His Skeleton Island, he found a map that curiously resembled Oak Island. But more important, it included specific bearings and measurements. Amos Noss worked for Hedden that year. He recalls how they studied the Kidd map and searched the underbrush south of the money pit.
I got a pick and a shovel, and I went down. Boy, it was hot. Flies, mosquitoes and things bother you. But anyhow, I went around. He told me within 50 feet or so where he thought it was. So I kept trying and trying, and finally I struck a rock. 2 or 3 rocks I kept trying with the pick, you know. And I tore up the sod, which is about, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 inches over the top of the stone. And I uncovered the thing. I went up one side, and I knew I had something then. I got to the point, there was none any further, so I came back on the other side, and I had what he was looking for.
Noss had uncovered a large triangle of stones. George Bates was on the survey crew that rushed to the island to check out this discovery. Would the stone triangle correlate with the Kidd map? They sighted from boreholes found in 2 large boulders. Then they took exact readings from the map, which used the old English system of rods. 18 west and by 7 east on rock, 30 southwest, took them precisely to the stone triangle. Then, 14 north, tree. The triangle pointed exactly due north, towards the money pit.
This seemed to confirm that the Kidd map did mean that treasure was in the vicinity.
Then, events took a bizarre turn. The book's author came forward and claimed that he had fabricated the Kidd map. Was he trying to conceal his sources? Or was the correlation between the map and Oak Island really an incredible coincidence? Because if that were the case, the money pit itself could be a complete hoax. Montreal journalist Darcy O'Connor is considered the leading expert on the Oak Island enigma.
I have seen the coconut fiber that has been brought up. I have seen reports by the Smithsonian and by independent botanists stating it's definitely coconut fiber. I have seen carbon dating results that Triton has gotten showing that it's several hundred years old, that it's not glacial wood they're finding under the ground, that the metal they're finding is pre-1750 and it's coming deep from under the ground. So there's no possible way it's a natural phenomena or a hoax. Someone was there at some time, and I can only assume to bury something of great value.
92-year-old Mel Chappell bought Oak Island in 1950 because he's also convinced of the existence of a treasure. He's intrigued by what his father discovered in the money pit in 1897.
Well, when his chisel drill that they were using encountered at around 153 feet, what appeared to be stone or concrete for a few inches, then underneath wood, and they pulled the chisel drill up and put on an auger and bored through 5 inches of wood. The chips came up, and when they pulled up the auger, this little fuzzy stuff was on the screw of the auger, and when they washed it out and cleaned it up and straightened it out, it turned out to be this piece of parchment.
Mel Chappell preserved this fragment of parchment no larger than a dime. Clearly, there is writing on it. Such clues have sustained belief in a buried treasure.
And my opinion, and his opinion was, that it is of immense value, whatever it is.
In 1959, Chappell leased treasure trove rights to Robert Restall and his wife Mildred. They gave up their careers as circus daredevils to move to the island, where Restall was convinced he would find the treasure and make a fortune for his family. He had no wealthy backers and no elaborate equipment. But his obsession carried him and his 2 boys through 6 years of back-breaking toil. Restall and his older son would work all day and talk about pirates all night. They became driven, mesmerized by the prospect of treasure. Mrs. Restall recalls their isolated life.
Well, you had to draw your water from a pond. And of course, no electricity, no radio, no television. We had acetylene lamps. And we had a gas stove for cooking. And that's it. I think I was closer to my boys because of our isolation than I would have been living on the mainland. Not mother and sons. We all became friends to one another.
August 17th, 1965. An old pump was draining a 27-foot shaft. No one knows for sure, but deadly carbon monoxide may have collected in the pit. Robert Restall was starting down when he suddenly became dizzy. Bobby thought his father had suffered a heart attack and rushed down to save him. 2 other workmen failed to realize what was wrong and also toppled in.
Now to get up, but be careful, be careful.
The autopsy report read, death by drowning. Mildred Restall now lives alone, still within sight of Oak Island.
At the time, I was up in the cabin, And I know it was after lunch, and I was expecting my husband to come up any time. And Rick came back to the cabin, passed the one that I was in, and went to his own cabin, the one he shared with his brother. And I thought that was rather odd. Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he come in and tell me that my husband would be up soon or something? And I waited a few minutes and then went down, and by then it was all over. And that's when I learned that my husband and son and 2 other men were dead. I have an idea that he thinks, at least at that time, he thought he was pretty close. And what he thought and what it was, I don't know. He didn't tell me. I didn't ask.
3 days after the Restall tragedy, a California mining conglomerate moved in. The death toll had reached 6. Disregarding the local legend that one more must die, this company and its successors continue the search. After 300 years, the secret of Oak Island has eluded all the resources of modern technology. But treasure hunters persist. The present company has dug down to 230 feet and is prepared to spend $3 million scooping out the entire end of the island if necessary. Whether it's one man with a pick and shovel or a giant corporation with dynamite and bulldozers, an unflagging obsession has drawn treasure hunters to Oak Island. Whoever conceived and executed the fiendish money pit so far has managed to outwit them all. There's a body of water from which the cry of distress comes more often per square mile than any other body of water in the world. It is not the Devil's Sea off Japan, the tumultuous waters of Cape Horn, nor the deadly calm of the Sargasso Sea. It is an area where the search and rescue capabilities have no equal. Not the Bermuda Triangle, but another triangle. A triangle formed by the Great Lakes, locked in the heart of industrial North America. Too often, the crack search and rescue units of Canada and the United States come back empty-handed. A ship or a plane vanished for no apparent reason or destroyed by forces no one can explain. An extraordinary statistic has been recently disclosed. Fully 1/3 of all the unsolved American air and sea disasters take place in the Great Lakes Triangle.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The man who has accumulated and assessed the data that has led him to designate the Great Lakes as perhaps the greatest disaster area in the world is J. Leland Gourlay. Jay Gourlay is not only an experienced author and journalist, he is also a highly qualified professional flying instructor.
I've flown thousands of miles through the Bermuda Triangle, and I've been out of radio contact with anyone there for as much as an hour at a time. It's much easier to understand how someone could disappear in a vast expanse of ocean like that than here, where you can see Canada off our right wingtip and the United States off our left wingtip. I can overfly this lake in less than 10 minutes. No one is ever out of radio contact here. We can communicate with at least 100 different government employees in the United States and Canada right now. It's inconceivable that anyone could disappear here.
And yet, disappear they do, and under circumstances of mystery. 50-mile-an-hour headwinds that no one else feels, dangers that come so suddenly, the victim never even cries for help. In terms of the sheer magnitude of tragedy, Gourlay has discovered that the Great Lakes surpass the so-called Bermuda Triangle. And the Bermuda Triangle covers some 1.5 million square miles, 16 times the size of the 5 Great Lakes combined. These are not strange remote waters or vast stretches of ocean. These are completely enclosed freshwater pools, the playground of Middle America. On the shores of the Great Lakes stand the great American cities of Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, and Cleveland. Piercing the sky over Toronto, on the shores of Lake Ontario, the highest man-made structure in the world. The CN Tower stands as the ultimate pinnacle of highly sophisticated communications technology.
Victor 98,
Traffic controllers urge pilots flying the lakes to report continuously to ground stations. A 10-second lapse will launch full-scale search and rescue. And yet, the fact remains that there is high incidence of inexplicable disaster. Jay Gourlay assiduously follows up any clue, any lead which may shed light on the mysterious tragedies. He has pursued high government officials in Washington and Ottawa, interviewed the men on the spot, the highly skilled search teams operated by the police and the Coast Guards of 2 nations. He has spent days at the marinas to discuss the weather peculiarities with yachtsmen whose lives depend on their knowledge.
What's the worst thing that can happen in a situation like that?
He has fed his voluminous documentation gathered over 2 years into the highly sophisticated computer banks at such electronics nerve centers as the University of Toronto, searching for patterns, searching for correlations, searching for explanations.
Stop it right there if you would. Oh, okay. That's the accident I was telling you about just off Milwaukee. That aircraft was at en route altitudes. It was talking to air traffic control. It was a clear day, very calm. The aircraft disappeared from radar from an altitude of about 5,000 feet. No trace of that airplane or anyone aboard it has ever been found to this day.
And finally, not dry data, but flesh and blood. Eyewitnesses who survived to describe their bewilderment. Such a man is Robert Joy, Jr. of Michigan, a policeman, a pilot, and a professor of criminology. On April 23rd, 1973, Bob watched his father vanish. His father was flying a safe, well-equipped amphibious aircraft.
Is there any difference between this airplane and the airplane your father disappeared in?
No, it's exactly the same type airplane.
Bob Joy was in another plane a few hundred feet away. They were over shallow Lake Erie. The water was not rough. There was no cry for help.
I got a radio message from my dad, and I couldn't understand what he said. The frequency that we were on was 122.8, the Unicom frequency. It's very congested. So I looked back out the right side of the airplane, and I didn't see the lake amphibian at all. It had been there right along through the whole trip.
No trace of the lake amphibian was ever found.
It disappeared completely.
The disappearances of small aircraft are hard enough to explain. The strange disasters of the Great Laker boats are perhaps even more mystifying. These are ships that are built for lakes, never far from shore, massively equipped with every conceivable safety and communications device. When the Edmund Fitzgerald was launched, it was the largest of the Great Laker boats. When she sailed from Duluth, Minnesota on November 9, 1975, she too was sailing safely in tandem with another Laker, the Arthur M. Anderson. They easily weathered a mild storm. But to be safe, the Fitzgerald checked her speed to close the distance between her and the Anderson. A snow flurry obscured their view briefly, but the radar told the Anderson that the Fitzgerald was less than 9 miles ahead. When the flurry lifted, the Anderson could see for 20 miles, but there was no Fitzgerald. She'd gone with a sudden convulsion to the bottom with all hands. When the wreckage was found, it was discovered that every lifeboat was still securely fastened.
The peculiar thing about that accident is that for 3 hours at least, the Edmund Fitzgerald was slowly filling up with water. We know that now, even though no one on board the Fitzgerald knew it at the time. What's really strange about this accident is that no one did know that. No one put on life jackets. No one called for distress. In fact, up until about 1 minute before the Fitzgerald finally went under the water, the first mate of the Fitzgerald was saying that the ship was all right. They were having no problem.
And what of the Kamloops and the strange events of December 7th, 1927? The Kamloops, too, had plotted a cautious course, entering Lake Superior in tandem with the freighter Quaydock. In the late afternoon, the men on the Quaydock sighted rocks ahead and swerved successfully to starboard to avoid them. The Kamloops was following and could clearly see the Quaydock's action. But the Kamloops sailed on, despite frantic warning blasts from the Quaydock's great steam whistle. She was not seen again. It was presumed she was dashed on the rocks of Isle Royale, but there was no wreckage, no bodies, no evidence whatsoever that the Kamloops had ever existed. Jay Gourlay's search into the strange history of the lakes led him back into the exhaustive records and preserved evidence of Great Lakes shipping kept at the Marine Museum on Toronto's waterfront.
Exactly the same spot.
Though contemporary events first aroused my interest in this region, research quickly led me into these records of the 18th and 19th century. We know, for example, that the first commercial vessel to sail on the Great Lakes, the Griffin, and all aboard her, vanished on her maiden voyage. From relics like these, we know precisely what has caused most shipping accidents. But this is not always true in the Great Lakes. Often, evidence is contradictory. Other times, evidence is totally non-existent.
There is, for example, an exquisite ship's figurehead found adrift, but there is no record of any ship ever carrying this figurehead. During the winter of 1902, divers searched unsuccessfully for the wreckage of the Bannockburn. They were not surprised because they could not believe that she had sunk. She was last spotted by a passing ship. She was pointed out by the skipper to his mate. But when the mate turned his head to look at the proud vessel, the Bannockburn was gone. From time to time over the years, she has been reported sailing on over the lakes. And then there were the wrecks that were only too painfully evident. But the phenomenon that destroyed them vanished as suddenly as it came. The Layfield, the James E. Davidson, the Hebrew, the Sachem, all proceeding through relatively calm waters when a single gigantic wave struck them down. A mountain of boiling water rising for one tumultuous moment. Meteorologists call them a Seiche wave, but cannot explain them. They were first recorded in the Great Lakes in 1872. They are not caused by wind. The bizarre events of the lakes go back beyond the first records of the white man. the so-called Seiche wave is part of the legend of the Chippewa Indians of Lake Superior. They still speak of Nanabazhu's sturgeon, a monster fish that with a flick of his tail was said to destroy the mightiest vessel. Indian legend is connected to another extraordinary case history. The ship was called the Wabuno, an Algonquin name for black magician. On November 20th, 1879, a doctor's wife claimed she had a vision of the ship's destruction. It was assumed she was hysterical. The wreckage was found in Lake Huron, battered by some tremendous force. But not a single body was ever recovered. But the growing legend of the lakes is not only based on misty tales of superstition. It is also based on cases that are all the more chilling because they are fully documented. United Airlines Flight 389, a Boeing 727 similar to this one, a flight from New York to Chicago, August 16, 1965. The facts are solid. The captain's voice was recorded by a traffic controller. The flight path was tracked on highly sophisticated NORAD equipment. There was no mechanical malfunction. 3 highly qualified pilots were on the flight deck. They could see Chicago in the distance. The aircraft descended perfectly normally to 6,000 feet. It was then instructed to level out according to regular procedure. But the aircraft did not level out. It continued to descend for 3 minutes until it flew right into Lake Michigan.
There was no attempt to arrest the descent. It was a clear day just like this. In fact, up until 1 second before the United Airlines Flight 389 hit the water, killing all 30 aboard, the pilot was talking to air traffic control about his altimeter setting. He was looking at his altimeter, he was setting it, he was paying attention to his altimeter. The co-pilot was flying the airplane. He could see the water below him, he could see the city of Chicago in the distance there, about 15 miles away. In light of these facts, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that no possible explanation can be offered for the action of this crew.
No possible explanation. And yet there is another case involving exactly the same elements. An altimeter charting a path to certain death.
Right here is where Detroit Departure Control cleared the Saberliner that was owned by General Motors to begin its approach into Pontiac. Up about 5 miles is where the Saberliner began its descent. And beyond that, another 2 miles is where the Saberliner finally crashed into the ground. At no time was there anything wrong with the aircraft itself. It was under full control of the pilot throughout the flight.
Here there is miraculously a survivor. He was the co-pilot that night, a man with vast experience and a spotless record, Howard Herbst.
I believe it was something like this. They said, you're cleared to 2,700 feet, cleared for the approach, contact Pontiac Tower at the outer marker. And 2,700 feet is the altitude for the procedure turn. So we descended the 300 feet to the 2,700 feet. That I know we were at. I checked that altitude, and both of us did. Everything was going along smoothly. We were doing the checklist, and when I got done with it, I saw the trees at the end of that checklist.
Why then did he descend below minimums that night? Why did he fly that Saberliner down into the ground?
I have no idea, really. I wish I could answer it, but I don't. It just happened, and the next thing I knew, we were in the trees, but I have no knowledge of why or no answer.
Howard Herbst has no answer, nor do the investigators who pored over the wreckage.
To understand how baffling this is, one must appreciate how meticulous these investigators are and the elaborate technology at their disposal. For example, they can determine 6 months after an accident whether or not a tiny indicator light was lit on impact.
Electronic microscopes tell these investigators whether there are scratches on a tiny metal part, whether there are scratches on scratches, which might indicate a different sort of structural failure. A highly scientific examination of every piece of wreckage can reconstruct the state of an aircraft as it existed at the moment of impact. When the investigators finally conclude that the cause of a crash is undetermined, it can be assumed that the mystery is very real indeed. Not just civilian aircraft, but military aircraft. In 1956, the CF-100 was the backbone of the Royal Canadian Air Force. A reliable jet fighter checked out with military precision every time it left the ground. Flown by young men with the razor-sharp reflexes of the fighter pilot. On May 15, 1956, a plane like this took off over the Great Lakes. Only seconds after its last routine transmission, it disappeared off radar. It was subsequently learned that the pilot had dropped 33,000 feet to his death without uttering a single word of distress.
Who was on that aircraft was here the other night talking to us about it.
In many cases, the circumstances are so mysterious as to give rise to theories that range from conservative scientific evaluations to fanciful speculations on the forces of outer and inner space. There appears to be, for example, a particular area of such heavy devastation as to be beyond the possibilities of coincidence. It is a line that extends, curiously enough, into the Bermuda Triangle. It is called the Agonic Line.
No mechanical problems at all.
The agonic line, or the line of zero magnetic variation, is the line along which magnetic north and true north are precisely the same direction. Now, how this would be related to a transportation accident or how it could cause such a tragedy has never been explained. But the fact remains that a number of such disasters have occurred on or near this line. For example, the disappearance of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, the disappearance of November 212 Alpha Delta, the implausible last actions of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
In searching for explanations, Jay Gourlay meticulously examined 86 air disasters and 45 shipping disappearances. In many cases, the only possible explanations seemed to be outside the range of conventional wisdom. Some could be explained by the vortex theory, the so-called black holes where matter drops in and out of space-time continua. Then there's the fact that the Great Lakes have heavy deposits of iron ore. There are well-founded theories of the magnetic field of the Earth reversing itself, of magnetic earthquakes which could destroy navigational capabilities. In 3 cases, the disappearance of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501 over Milwaukee, the crash of a PA-22 into the shore ice of Lake Michigan, and the sudden destruction of the Edmund Fitzgerald, unidentified flying objects were independently and reliably reported in the disaster area.
And so there are many theories: strange atmospheric forces, electromagnetic anomalies, the agonic line, psychic forces, even the presence of UFOs. As for my own opinion, after 2 years of research, none of these theories is adequate. None of them is verifiable. Yet none can be discounted.
Jay Gourlay continues to gather evidence, but as his search continues, the clues do not offer a ready explanation. In the heart of the Great Lakes is the mighty force of Niagara Falls, known as the Maid of the Mist. It is perhaps the most spectacular example of nature let loose. When men die here, there is no question as to why. The mystery is in the surrounding waters, where there is no apparent reason for sudden death. Stretching out 1,000 miles from the Maid of the Mist, the Great Lakes Triangle is joining those other areas of mystery that form the tragic folklore of unexplained disaster. World War II is not just a memory in the coastal mountains of Brazil. The date is April 22nd, 1978. The place is a small hotel outside Rio de Janeiro. A noisy party at the Hotel Till is broken up by police who discover the people are celebrating something odd. The 89th anniversary of the birthday of Adolf Hitler. The raid resulted in the capture of a wanted Nazi named Gustav Wagner. The capture was made possible by Simon Wiesenthal, who is known as the Hunter, for he has brought more than 1,100 Nazi criminals to justice. In 1945, the Russians liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp and came face to face with a world of horror. The chief doctor of Auschwitz was Joseph Mengele, who had come to be called the Angel of Death. He was never apprehended, and he remains as the most wanted Nazi criminal in the world.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
In Vienna today, World War II is not just history. Every corner of the city holds memories of the war, especially for those who cannot forget. Simon Wiesenthal cannot forget. It would be easy to say that what motivates Wiesenthal are his nightmare memories of the war. But many others have vivid memories of the Holocaust. Yet Wiesenthal is the only man who remains as a Nazi hunter. From the beginning, what drove Wiesenthal was his will to impose justice. And from the beginning, Wiesenthal's will for justice has been matched against Joseph Mengele's will to escape it.
Joseph Mengele was a doctor of philosophy and medicine who performed horrifying experiments on humans and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Simon Wiesenthal's training as an architect would have little bearing on his life's work as an international detective. Joseph Mengele allowed himself to be caught up in the Nazi tide. Simon Wiesenthal had no choice.
Mengele's life as a Nazi criminal began at Auschwitz. 5 million people died here. Every day, trainloads of men, women, and children arrived at this train siding. When people stepped off the train, the man they were most likely to see was Joseph Mengele. He was always immaculate in his sharply pressed uniform, and he was always unruffled as he decided each person's fate. If he would nod to the left, it meant hard work and starvation. If he would nod to the right, it meant a brief walk to what people believed were showers. Either way, the results were the same. Today, in a quiet corner of Vienna, there is a woman who remembers the totally unemotional character of the Angel of Death. Dr. Ella Lingens was a prisoner and physician at Auschwitz who was forced to work as an assistant to Joseph Mengele.
Well, he was, you might say, especially bad because you felt that he was a cynic, that he didn't believe at all in the idea behind this extermination of Jews in the way the others did. As somebody told that he had once said, he didn't despise the Jews, he didn't think they were inferior, what all the others really believed. But he said, no, there are two gifted people in the world, the Germans and the Jews, and it's just a struggle for world domination, and one of them will win.
The Germans did not win, and Mengele saw it coming. He realized that the Russians would soon reach Auschwitz from the east. So he headed west, towards the Allies who were liberating Europe, and towards his home. While the entire continent was reeling from the shocks of war, Mengele actually had his Auschwitz chauffeur drive him home. Home was near Munich, in the Bavarian town of Günzburg, where the Mengele family owned a large factory and was the largest employer in town. Even today, In Search of crews encountered outright hostility when trying to film there. Mengele would remain in Günzburg totally free for almost 6 years. Just after the war, Mengele went largely unnoticed in the crowd of Nazi criminals, and it was not until 1950 that his name came to prominence in connection with Auschwitz. Mengele then fled Günzburg with the aid of Odessa, the secret SS organization that helped its members escape Germany. He went to Italy, making the border crossing at Reichenpass, near the northern Italian town of Merano. From Italy, Mengele sailed to Buenos Aires, Argentina. He arrived here sometime in 1952. Mengele found it easy to hide in Buenos Aires. Large German migrations in the last century created what are now substantial German colonies in South America. These colonies were natural havens for Nazis on the run at the end of the war. Mengele not only lived here on Sarmiento Street as a free man, but actually practiced medicine without a license in this house. He is reported to have met in this palace with Argentina's then president, Juan Domingo Perón. With this kind of protection, Mengele felt completely safe. But he could not know that his safety was only temporary. In Vienna, Mengele's movements had been carefully reconstructed at a place called the Center for Documentation. The patient years of tracking Mengele finally paid off for Simon Wiesenthal in 1957.
I found Mengele in Buenos Aires as a practicing doctor. I give the information to the German, to the court in Freiburg and Breisgau, and through Bonn, through the German ambassador in Argentina, they asked for extradition.
Virties 968 was the address of the house where Wiesenthal found Mengele. It would take almost 2 years, until 1959, before Argentina replied to Germany's request for Mengele's extradition. Argentina's answer came as a shock.
The Procurador de la Nación give the answer: the crimes of Mengele are political and not criminal. And I think this was the green light for Eichmann, because if they don't extradite a man who was in charge of field operations to send hundreds of thousands of people to the gas chamber, and they see in this crimes a political crime, they would not extradite Eichmann.
Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped in Buenos Aires in 1960. His capture was the direct result of information supplied by Wiesenthal to Israeli agents. Eichmann's trial lasted 9 months, and as Wiesenthal had hoped, it reminded the entire world of the Holocaust. But Eichmann's capture also had another effect. Joseph Mengele vanished from Buenos Aires. At the very moment that Germany was trying to extradite Mengele from Argentina, he actually returned home to German soil for his father's funeral. He stood on this spot for the funeral service. Although he was widely known as a wanted man in Germany, no one in Günzburg reported his presence to the authorities, even though he stayed here for 6 weeks. Later, Germany's public prosecutor would say that the people of Günzburg had acted like a group of conspirators to help the Mengele family. Mengele helped himself after Eichmann's capture by going to Egypt, where there was a large German community. Unfortunately for Mengele, the Egyptian government did not want him. The Eichmann trial had created a strong anti-Nazi sentiment throughout the world, and the Egyptians did not want to antagonize the Americans or the Russians. Mengele's German comrades in Egypt chartered a yacht to take him to the remote Greek island of Kitnos. These photographs were taken by a reporter hired by Wiesenthal. The reporter was part of a group sent by Wiesenthal when he discovered Mengele was on the island. But it was too late. Mengele had sailed away 2 days before the group arrived. South America had kept him safe for most of the last 10 years, so he went to the heart of the continent. Joseph Mengele, now Jose Mengele, openly became a citizen of Paraguay in 1960. He could not have picked a safer place.
A big number of Germans emigrate after the war to Paraguay, after this war to Paraguay, and they reorganized the police, and today many of the children of the SS are today members of the police in Paraguay. And the small Jewish colony in Paraguay, they receive every week threats from the Germans. When something will happen against Mengele, they will kill them. And I had here in my office a delegation of this Jewish community from Paraguay, and they asked me to promise them to do nothing against Mengele in Paraguay because their life is in danger. And I believed them.
Even so, Mengele did not feel entirely safe in Paraguay. During his first years here, he kept moving from place to place in the capital city of Asunción. He is known to have stayed at the Hotel Colonial, which is now a bank. His neighbors at the Hotel Astra would hear him in this corner room, screaming in the night. Number 508 on this street was probably his last residence in the city. Even though Mengele is never sure about his own safety, he is legally free in Paraguay. The fact is, however, he is wanted by several countries. One of these is the Federal Republic of Germany. Its ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Bernd von Staden.
Joseph Mengele continues to be a wanted man and will continue to be a wanted man until he is put on trial or until he dies. It has been our policy from the very beginning to prosecute and to put to trial these criminals ourselves wherever we could. And it is in line with this policy that whenever we find out that a criminal is abroad in a third country and we have sufficient certainty of a crime committed to ask for extradition, it is a policy consequently then to ask for extradition.
But Paraguay's President Stroessner, who is himself of German descent, has always refused to give up Mengele. On Washington's Embassy Row, diplomacy calls for polite language, even in the most strained circumstances. The Minister of the Embassy of Israel, the Honorable Hanan Baron.
The other. I certainly would very much hope indeed that if Joseph Mengele or any other Nazi criminal would be discovered and caught in any country, that this country would find it in its own ways and means to bring the person to justice, and if it cannot do so, to extradite him as quickly as possible to either Israel or to a country in which he can be brought to justice. I cannot perceive and conceive of a responsible government in the world which would not want to have Nazi criminals brought to justice.
The efforts to obtain Mengele's extradition proved to be fruitless. Nevertheless, Mengele's fear of capture drove him deeper into the heartland of Paraguay. His destination was the remote eastern part of the country near the Paraná River. Very few outsiders are seen here, and those that come to look for Joseph Mengele do so at their own risk. Just before In Search of arrived, 2 film crews, one British and one Belgian, had their film destroyed and were expelled from the country. In Search of could only film using a camera hidden inside a car. Mengele spent a lot of time in the Paraná region on the estate of Alban Krug, a wealthy German industrialist who surrounded him with 4 bodyguards. But what protects Mengele more than anything else is his uncanny ability to avoid capture. This is the German-style resort town of Honau in central Paraguay. It was here in 1964 that Mengele came closest to being apprehended. A group of survivors of Auschwitz learned that Mengele was staying at the Hotel Tyrol. They came here and rushed up to his room, only to find it empty. Mengele had left just 10 minutes earlier, after receiving a warning phone call. He was in such a hurry that he left in his pajamas. There are times when Mengele ventures outside Paraguay, but these times are rare because they involve a higher risk. One such occasion was in 1968, when Mengele went to Bermuda to meet some relatives. Wiesenthal learned about the trip and immediately sent a man to verify Mengele's identity. But once again, Mengele was already gone.
The closer one gets to Mengele, the more elusive he seems to become. In Paraguay today, he is wrapped in legend. Wiesenthal must constantly guard against false rumors and mistaken identities. Wherever Mengele is in Paraguay, he has the protection of the Stroessner regime.
There are times when even the remote Paraná region does not seem safe enough. Mengele then takes refuge in a large military zone in central Paraguay. It is a place so secure that even the Paraguayan police cannot enter it. In 1977, 2 events involving Mengele took place that are here reenacted for In Search of. One of the last times Mengele was reliably spotted was when he was seen talking to 2 unidentified men on the Brazilian side of the Paraná River. Border checkpoints are few and far between here, and there is no record of his having made a border crossing. The most recent attempt to capture Mengele was made in that same year, when it was discovered that he was due to cross the border from Paraguay to Argentina at a given place and time. On that day, several agents were placed on the Argentine side of the border. Mengele's car was spotted, and the license plate noted some 5 miles from the crossing. But at the last minute, the car turned around and headed back into the Paraguayan interior. Today, Mengele's whereabouts can only be pinpointed by checking the most reliable sources in Paraguay itself. In Search of made contact with members of Paraguay's opposition party, who verified that this hardware store belongs to Joseph Mengele. Those same sources brought us to the small town of Altos. This road, which leads to a well-guarded gate which we were unable to photograph, is the access to a hacienda named Campo Condesa de Cue, where Mengele lives today. "33 years is a long time, and the Holocaust seems far away. Now, there are two men who remain as living symbols of that moment in history. The hunted is 67. The hunter is 69.
Look, if he will die before me, he will not die in peace, because he has no rest. He is going from place to place. And this is also a part of a sentence. And you cannot make a deal with the Lord that I must survive Mengele. My last wish will be, in this case, to get Mengele. But nobody knows. I hope always that there's no perfect crimes, and even the biggest criminal and the best criminal make a mistake, and I am waiting for his mistakes.
There was once a world in Europe that no longer exists, but it left behind an echo.
The history of man is a history of crimes, and especially the Jewish history is a history full of repetitions. It's only the technology is changing, but the hatred remains the same. We need Mengele before a trial as a witness of the history. The trial has a bigger importance than the sentence.
Justice is a funny thing. No matter how man tries to impose himself, it follows its own course. "3,000 years ago, a 9-year-old boy was crowned king of Egypt, an empire which was one of the most powerful in the ancient world. He would become a relatively unimportant pharaoh, involved more with the passions of life than the details of state. Yet in death, Tutankhamun would play a role in history far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The importance of the pyramids in the ancient Egyptian concept of life and death is still not thoroughly understood. It now seems likely, however, that the history of their unique religion, symbolized by the pyramids, may have been altered by the death of King Tutankhamun.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Few places in the world are as forsaken and unchanging as the Sahara Desert. People's lives are simple, uncomplicated by modern measures of time and mortality. The peasants mark the passing of their lifespans by the annual rotation of pasture lands and by the seasonal tilling, planting, and harvesting of their meager crops. For most, the present and future exist in the shadow of the past. Symbolic of ancient Egyptian civilization are the enigmatic pyramids which dot the desert landscape. Giant monoliths, they are silent tributes to the genius of a bygone civilization. Many are now falling into ruin, but their crumbling walls reveal little of the purposes for their original existence. Most scholars are convinced that they were constructed as giant tombs for dead pharaohs. It is also documented that they became easy prey for grave robbers who either found or constructed their own passages within the mammoth walls so that they could strip the chambers of their precious artifacts. Realizing that the pyramids were being desecrated, the high Egyptian priests began diligently searching for a location where their royal tombs would go unnoticed and undisturbed. Across the Nile and 400 miles south of modern-day Cairo, the priests found what they had been looking for: a valley with imposing cliffs, an area that, because it could conceal countless tombs, would later become known as the Valley of the Kings. It was here that the modern quest would begin for the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Just after the turn of the century, Egypt remained the keystone of the proud yet slowly diminishing British Empire. Egypt's position straddling the Suez was still all important to English military strategists. Yet for many Britons, the sprawling Sahara Desert that dominated the country represented either a warm, dry vacation spot or a land rich in archaeological treasure.
The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon in 1799 and deciphered some 20 years later, finally provided the key to solving the riddle of the hieroglyphs. Written in Greek, Coptic, and in hieroglyphics, scholars were finally able to understand the tiny symbols. From pictographs and hieroglyphs unearthed during later digs in Egypt, part of the story of Tut would emerge. In Search of Cameras would, from these facts, recreate the days of King Tut. The boy had become crowned pharaoh in approximately 1500 BC. Information about his reign remained sketchy. All that was known was that the priestly court advisors probably extended a great deal of control over the young boy called Tutankhamun. But one significant portion of the story had not been recorded: the whereabouts of King Tut's tomb. The Valley of the Kings had already yielded the tombs of many other pharaohs. Thus, it seemed a logical place to begin the search for the final resting place of the boy monarch. By 1921, Egyptian workers had excavated more than a dozen sites in the Valley of the Kings, vainly searching for Tut's tomb. The dream of finding gold, jewels, and other great riches in King Tutankhamun's grave seemed more and more an archaeologist's folly. Their work had been directed by a young, obsessive British civil servant named Howard Carter. His one passion in life was to find the tomb. Aiding him in his effort was Lord Carnarvon, an English nobleman who had originally sought refuge from England's damp weather in the healthful dryness of the Sahara. For 5 long years, Carnarvon had funded Carter's fruitless efforts to find the elusive burial plot. Despite the find of a new, more promising dig site, Carnarvon decided to return to England, threatening to cut off financial support. For another year, hundreds of workers labored over the new site that Carter had found. Then, in November 1922, Carter made an extraordinary breakthrough. He wired Carnarvon, at last, made wonderful discovery in Valley. Together, Carter and Carnarvon descended the steps to the tomb. Both trembled with nervous anticipation. For each man, the passing moments meant that he was closer to fulfilling a dream. But what would they find? Would it indeed be the undisturbed sarcophagus of Tut? The royal seals had remained untouched. But did that mean that the tomb and its contents had stayed just as they were when hidden 3,000 years before? Finally, Carter felt the last bits of mortar give way. He peered inside and was stunned by the sight before him. "What do you see?" asked Carnarvon. There was a pause. Then Carter softly replied, "Wonderful things." It took the British and Egyptian governments the next 11 years to carefully remove and painstakingly catalog all of the objects from inside the tomb. But Lord Carnarvon would not see even half of the treasure. By 1923, he would be stricken under mysterious circumstances. Prior to his return to England, Carnarvon suffered a mosquito bite. Normally, such an occurrence would not cause great alarm, but the bite became infected, and he finally succumbed to its effects. Interestingly enough, legend had said that the priests had cursed the pharaoh's tomb, and that those who disturbed it would die. Newspapers around the world announced Carnarvon's death. Then, mysteriously, others began dying. Coincidentally, each person had either been associated with the tomb's opening or the examination of the objects found inside. For a while, the curse seemed very real. But the papers neglected to mention that Carter, who was the first to enter the tomb, and hundreds of others associated with Tut, remained robust and alive. Today, there seems little fear of the curse. More than 7 million people in 6 American cities pushed their way into the Tut exhibit, eager to view the objects which had so astounded Carter and Carnarvon, and there were no reports of mysterious deaths attributed to the curse. The nearly untouched tomb of King Tut that Carter and Carnarvon had unearthed was unmatched in history. It spoke of beauty and elegance in a vanished civilization. The romance of Tutankhamun's curse unfortunately obscured the more significant story of Tut for nearly 50 years. We are just beginning to realize that his death may have contributed to one of the most powerful religious movements in history. Many Egyptologists believe that the pyramids provided final earthly protection to royalty during their transition from the material world to that of eternal peace. Dr. James Brashler heads the Institute of Antiquities and Christianity at Claremont College.
For the ancient Egyptian, death was simply a transition from one theater of existence or one arena of life to another arena, which they called the West. It was the land to which one went after existence in this life came to a conclusion. Death was simply the opening up of a new kind of life that seems to have been conceived of in terms of a paradise.
There was a panoply of gods to be pleased, and elaborate rituals had to be performed successfully before one could enter the Egyptian Garden of Eden. The common citizen did not possess such knowledge. Only the priests could guide people to life everlasting, and their special skills gave them an extraordinary hold over the lives of the Egyptians. Whether ancient Egyptians thought that they could defeat death itself through the mummification process is not known. Scientists have carefully examined the mummies of Egyptian royalty. Despite concerted efforts, researchers remain mystified by the methods utilized by the ancients to preserve the body. "3,000-year-old stone reliefs depicted the immense power wielded by the priest class in ancient Egypt. It was their responsibility to begin planning for a pharaoh's death as soon as he became king. At the time of Tutankhamun's coronation, the priests remained the single most powerful body within Egyptian society.
When Tutankhamun, a 9-year-old boy, came to the throne, the situation was ripe for change.
Gerald LaRue is a professor of religion at the University of Southern California.
Who worked with this malleable young man who helped to formulate his ideas, we don't know. Perhaps the great court advisor, Ai, was involved in this. Perhaps there were priests from Thebes who reached him. His predecessor, Akhenaten, had moved away from the traditional religions of ancient Egypt. Egypt had enjoyed the freedom of worship of many gods in many different forms. But Akhenaten had made a change. He had moved from polytheism to monotheism, the emphasis on one god in one form.
Following the death of Akhenaten, it is generally accepted that his belief in one god disappeared. The priests had discouraged its acceptance by the general populace because it threatened their position of power. But some scholars theorize that small groups clung to monotheism and quite possibly spread the idea across the desert.
There was no way that the young child Tut could understand the religious turmoil which he had entered. The affairs of state unquestionably rested with the priests. With a child pharaoh on the throne, it would be easy for them to completely reinstate the old religion. Meanwhile, Tut wrestled with the normal problems of growing into manhood.
Drawings made during Tutankhamun's reign often depict him with his young bride, the daughter of his predecessor Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Tut married his young bride when she was 12 and he only 9. Tut must have spent many carefree hours in the royal gardens, involved with the whimsical delights that only young lovers can devise. As Tut and his wife Ankensenpaten grew up together, they seem to have possessed a great love for one another. A poem read to Tut by his bride has survived 3,000 years.
My love to thee is like the acorn which I have planted with flowers in the manner of sweet-smelling herbs. And in the acre is a pool, that in the cool of the north wind, it is a lovely place where I walk there. Your hand upon mine, my body satisfied, and my heart glad that our going together is as intoxicating as to hear thy voice. And my life depends upon hearing thee. Whenever I see thee, it is better to me than food and drink.
Tut's great appreciation for life and his intense love for Akensenpatan would be cut short. He would not live to his 20th birthday.
Scholars are not at all certain what caused the death of Tutankhamun. The mummy itself was somewhat decomposed because of the excessive use of unguents and spices that the priests carried out. And therefore, the physical evidence is ambiguous. Some who have investigated suggest then that the death of Tutankhamun probably came as a result of respiratory ailments such as tuberculosis or pneumonia.
Still others believe that his death may have been hastened by poison. I, the great court priest who was present when Tut was crowned, now watched over the young pharaoh. Whether he was a member of a possible conspiracy with other court priests to terminate Tut's life is not known. Tut was now 19, an adult. It is possible that the priests feared they could no longer control him, and he might return to the ways of Akhenaten. Perhaps they wished him dead, for his death, like his coronation, could serve them well. Their power over the religious direction of Egypt would continue. Following Tut's death, he was launched on a journey to afterlife. The priests left behind now made a pantheon of deities, the gods of Egypt. Bedouins still trek over the same plains where Moses fled more than 2,000 years ago to avoid persecution for his belief in one God. It is possible that Moses was influenced by those who had faithfully held to Akhenaten's belief in monotheism. Once Tut died, it can be assumed that the few believers who still remained faced the wrath of the priests. It is very likely that they became a highly committed nomadic group who tenaciously clung to their singular beliefs. Tut's death may have affected the entire sweep of Western thought and religion. Not even his priestly advisors could have envisioned such a dramatic place in history for their young king. The science of Egyptology is less than 100 years old. While the glory of the Egyptian civilization has been well documented, there remains much to be uncovered and understood about its sophisticated culture. With the unearthing of each new artifact, our knowledge grows, not only about an ancient society, but its effect upon modern man as well. Only now are we beginning to appreciate how Tut's premature death may have had a significant impact on the development of the belief in one God. Throughout history, man has felt a unique kinship with animals. The special relationship between pet and master may be based upon an unexpected link. Only recently has science begun to investigate the possibility of a psychic, extrasensory connection. At the Psychical Research Foundation, this subject is about to begin an important experiment involving her pet kitten. Though they are separated by more than half a mile, she will attempt to reach out with her mind and influence the animal. If the kitten responds, can it prove the existence of Animal ESP?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
It is August in Walcott, Indiana, and Bobby is lost. He became separated from his family 5 hours ago as they were moving from their old home to a new home more than 2,000 miles away. They searched for him, but not finding him, sadly had to continue on. Now abandoned, he struggles through a long journey. We would expect him to turn back along the route they have traveled, to return to his old home. But Bobby pushes forward, searching for a place he's never known. No matter how great the obstacles, Bobby travels on as though drawn by some unseen beacon. Researchers call this side trailing, from the word psychic. It's often confused with homing, but it's quite another phenomenon. Homing occurs when an animal is taken away from a familiar place and finds its way back following normal sensory cues. A dog may follow a trail or remember familiar landmarks. But in verified cases of side trailing, there is no explanation other than ESP. 6 months later, Bobby arrives in Portland, Oregon. Finally, he's reunited with those he loves. Was Bobby guided by emotional signals from his family? Could it be that extrasensory perception was the magnet that pulled the animal and his masters together? The possibilities of Animal ESP could have a profound effect on all of us. Some forms of communication could be drastically altered, maybe even become obsolete. Stories such as Bobby's have intrigued scientists for years. His case is among hundreds examined by Dr. J.B. Rhine, America's Dean of Parapsychology. For Dr. Rhine, such examinations are a labor of love.
There's a great deal of evidence that there is an extrasensory exchange between animals and men. We'd like to have more evidence. We'd like to keep the question open rather than making it a decisive conclusion at this time, but there's a great deal of evidence on it.
Solomon! Come on, Solomon!
Anecdotes of side trailing are not conclusive proof of Animal ESP, but they do suggest that the bond between some masters and pets may be so deep that even distance cannot separate them. While a director at the Rockland Research Institute in New York, Dr. Hans Esser searched for laboratory evidence of this unspoken link between masters and their dogs. Each dog in the study was placed in an isolated soundproof chamber. There, his physical activity and heart rate were recorded. Dr. Esser selected dogs with a close relationship with their masters, feeling these teams would most likely demonstrate an ESP link. The master was then isolated in a separate soundproof room.
We will try in this experiment to replicate the bond established between you and your dog, and in general between master and dog. try to experience it as fully as possible so that the emotion you feel and you generate can be picked up by your dog.
The only possible connection between master and dog would be ESP.
Okay, the dog's lying down now. We can begin. Will you mark?
All right.
Start. You'll have the first event. Now.
The master was shown a series of slides. Some were pleasant subjects, evoking a positive reaction. Others were disturbing. Would the dog perceive a change in his master's mood?
The dog is perceiving probably emotional reaction from the master. This, in our thinking, takes place through the oldest part of our brain. This brain is non-verbal. It does not talk, but it does form the seed of our emotions.
Although this experiment is a preliminary investigation, a pilot study, Dr. Esser did record a correlation in a few instances. He continued with phase 2.
Gary, I do want you now to imagine exactly the episode of pleasure that you had this morning with Solomon, and in your mind recollect the whole event in the park.
Finding laboratory proof of animal ESP is most difficult. This study is among the first to begin the search and raised an even greater question.
What I am investigating is actually the so-called web of life, the relationships between every single living being in the large society of this earth. It is nowadays an ecological concept. How do we all hang together?
While the study did not provide proof, it had set the theme for our search and would lead us to further fascinating evidence. Beyond emotions, might our animals also perceive when we are having an extrasensory or psychic experience? During times of great stress, people have reported having out-of-body experiences, feeling literally that they can leave their own form, hover above it, or travel to other places. Such reports are not uncommon. But some people, like Sherry Green, feel they can actually control the phenomenon. Sherry says she's able to have an out-of-body experience at will. Could her pet kitten respond to her experience? And if so, would this indicate animal ESP? A classic experiment tested this question. In Search of reunited key investigators from the Psychical Research Foundation of Durham, North Carolina. Researchers take Sherry and her kitten to an observation room half a mile away. The kitten will remain here for the experiment.
And this is where Jill's going to be. And Johnny's going to be charting Jill's movements and also the number of times that she meows. And this is where we want you to focus your experience.
Sherry returns to the lab to have her out-of-body experience. The experiment is supervised by Dr. John Hartwell.
Sherry, we're plugging in the last of these wires here now so that we can learn something about the physiology of this experience. In addition to how the animal responds, we want to know something about how it is that your body responds.
We began to pursue these studies because the subjective nature of the out-of-body experience begs for that kind of research. For in this experience, a person feels like he is out of his body. He feels like he is out there and perceives the world from a different point of view, and perhaps he affects the world. Now, okay,
in the critical moments before the experiment, Sherry's brain waves and pulse are closely monitored. She meditates and prepares for her experience. A half a mile away, the kitten is placed on the observation grid. She paces restlessly in the alien, unfamiliar surroundings. The experimenters wonder if the kitten's behavior will change during Sherry's experience. As Sherry meditates, she signals her experience is about to begin.
Mark, that's 10:02.
Sherry now feels she is leaving her body to visit her kitten. She attempts to calm and reassure it with her presence, to make it feel more secure in a strange place. Each trial lasted several minutes. Over 33 trials, the researchers found a striking correlation. Whenever the subject reported an out-of-body experience, the kitten became measurably quieter and calmer. Its behavior had changed dramatically. Whether the kitten actually saw or felt a presence, no one can say. But during these out-of-body experiences, something was happening.
We tried people, animals, physical sensors, various electromagnetic detectors. The only consistent evidence that we found was the behavior of this one kitten. The fact that the kitten gave the only consistent results there is intriguing. We don't know what that means, but it does seem to us that it is very important. And we would like to try to go further and see if we can come to interpret that way.
If further study reveals that animals have psychic abilities, might some species be able to use them to alter their world? And might we someday learn to communicate with our pets through ESP? The In Search of cameras turn to these questions next. The possibility that animals can perceive their world through extrasensory means leads to further questions. Can they influence their world through psychokinesis, mind over matter? Could an animal with primitive mental ability, such as a fish, exert an influence on its environment? Current research suggests this may be so. At the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, Dr. William Broad conducts an experiment to determine if a Siamese fighting fish can alter the conditions in its tank. The male Siamese fighting fish is extremely aggressive. It displays hostile behavior to other males, and even to its own reflection in a mirror. Given the choice, it will seek out a male to challenge. To study the effects of this aggressive desire, Dr. Broad has designed a special aquarium. Along one side is a mirror that is only visible to the fish at irregular intervals, selected at random by a special generator. To determine when the mirror will be visible, the generator uses the same random principle as flipping a coin. Through many trials, the mirror should appear exactly half the time. Yet, when the fighting fish is placed in the special tank, a consistent and startling change takes place. The mirror begins to appear more than half the time. Could the fish and its desire to fight cause a change in the random operation of the generator?
The fish seemed to influence the random generator. That is, after about 3,400 trials, the machine started generating more mirror trials than you would expect by chance. But if you take the fish out, that effect goes away. And the most simple explanation of that is that the fish is somehow influencing that generator, although there's no physical connection between the two. That is, some kind of psychokinetic influence is being displayed here. In human beings, for example, there's considerable research that indicates that persons can mentally influence a variety of systems, living systems, inanimate systems, small ones, large ones, simply by imagining or intending for certain outcomes to occur. And apparently the same thing is occurring in the Siamese fighting fish in this experiment.
Dr. Broad is also searching to discover what extrasensory link there may be between animal and man. His subjects have had success influencing the behavior of a mouse-like gerbil without even being in the same room.
A lot of us feel a special closeness with animals, a kind of connectedness that goes beyond the usual kinds of relationships with animals. And what the data of parapsychology is suggesting is that this feeling of connectedness, or this fact of connectedness, may be much more general, that we are, in fact, intimately connected with other human beings, with animals, with all aspects of nature.
Parapsychologists aren't certain what this intimate connection may be. There is a theory that the unintentional psychic abilities of the researchers affect the outcome of every experiment. So it's not yet possible to isolate and prove animal ESP. In Cincinnati, a veterinarian finds the concept vitally important in his practice. Veterinary science is one of the most difficult fields of medicine, for the doctor cannot communicate with the patient.
What happened to this little fellow? Did he?
Dr. Marvin Kane is a former veterinarian of the Cincinnati Zoo and has practiced for 23 years. He welcomes the most difficult cases.
5 days ago, you presented your dog completely paralyzed, no feeling. We've treated him, we've taken x-rays, myelograms, and there's no definite disturbance of the vertebrae. He has responded to a point, but yet there is no realization of where his legs and feet are.
Having studied in China, Dr. Kane now teaches acupuncture to other vets and continues his search for new ways to relieve animals' suffering. One of his greatest allies is a consultant whom he feels has the gift of communicating with animals through ESP. She's Beatrice Leidecker of Los Angeles.
I like to think of myself as a diagnostic tool to a veterinarian, because an animal can't say where it hurts, but he hurts. And the vets many times say, I know the animal's sick, but I can't pinpoint it. And I feel that when I first met Dr. Kane, he was skeptical. He wanted some proof, which I couldn't blame him.
Now, after having been stimulated by the possibility that someone could indeed look into and perceive an animal's body and mind, this opened up a new possibility of diagnosis for me, and I decided to test Miss Leidecker and take x-rays of a known diagnostic patient and see whether or not she would come up with the same solution that I did.
Dr. Kane prepared his test with a thoroughbred jumping horse whose tiny yet painful leg fractures he had already diagnosed. Could Beatrice discover the problem through mental communication with the horse itself?
He had one horse there that was a jumper, and he was having difficulty with him. And he asked me, can you tell me what's wrong with him? When I asked the horse, how do you feel physically when you're jumping? He showed me a picture in my mind of him going over the jump. And when he landed on his front feet, I felt sharp pain going down my arms. The pain going down the back of my arms, which would be equal to his splint bone.
Astoundingly, Beatrice had described exactly the fractures in each foreleg.
I was very conscious of the fact that she did not even look at the parts of the horse as we would go about examining them. She stood there and she just communicated, seemingly communicated with the horse. After 5 years from that first initial experience, I still am amazed, and I'm still, well, now I'm very respectful of Beatrice's ability to look into and communicate with an animal's consciousness. I feel that possibly we all might have that ability, and we all should try to exercise it.
For 10 years, Beatrice has traveled the country helping animals and their owners through ESP. In her books, she reveals that the process is still a mystery.
I cannot explain to you what the mode of transmitting the mental pictures and things are. It's nothing that I can say that I can feel. I don't even know that it could be measured on an instrument, but it's there. We're all born with it as children, and you can put children and animals together and they can talk to each other with no problem at all.
Beatrice finds we can recapture this extrasensory ability and reports success teaching owners to communicate with their pets.
Now tonight I'm going to be teaching you a new language transmitted by mental pictures. Now to the degree that you believe in what you're doing, to that degree you will have success, no more and no less. The important thing is that at first you cannot tell if it's something the animal's communicating to you or if it's your imagination. So no matter what you get, no matter what the feeling is, the picture, the hunch, whatever you call it, act on it. Because as you use it, as you practice it, you will begin to tell later on whether it really is your imagination or whether it's something the animal's really telling you. The people that make the best students are the ones that can forget themselves long enough to get inside of something else, to see life from that animal's point of view and say, hey, maybe their motivation's different. People write to me all the time and say, wow, my life is so different, you know. It has just totally changed my attitudes with my animals, and we now have a different relationship.
Professional animal keepers, like those at Kings Island Park in Ohio, ask Beatrice to visit their animals and communicate with them. The results are often striking. She has helped solve the most difficult behavioral and medical problems.
What I hope people will come to understand about themselves, about the animals, and about ESP between us is that here's a new exciting dimension. We have a lot to learn, and I hope that people will really find the dimension of excitement that I'm just beginning to scratch the surface on. It isn't just in our pets, but it's in the whole animal kingdom. And I often wonder if that isn't what God meant when he said, "Ask the beasts of the field, and they shall teach thee, and the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, and they shall declare it unto thee."
In all the earth, there are fewer bonds closer than those between us and our animals. From the romping days of childhood to the quieter hours of later years, our animals are there as companions, comforters, and confidants. Many of us feel that this relationship is not hampered by the lack of a common language, because the relationship goes beyond words, into the realm of feeling. Just as human beings share ESP experiences with one another, it may be that the bond between humans and animals is but another link on that same chain. The more animal ESP is investigated, the more we may learn that a bond between us and animals is real, and that we are all, in fact, connected in a web of life. Perhaps someday, we will communicate clearly and directly with animals, avoiding the barriers of language. And this may lead to better communication among us all. Our exploration of the animal ESP link might help us to discover other secret abilities in ourselves.